In Viking society, life was not what you imagine. Not constant battles, not endless glory, but survival, cold, hunger, and discipline. Most Vikings were not warriors. They were farmers, living in harsh northern lands where winters were long and resources were limited. Every day was about survival. Food was never guaranteed. Families relied on fishing, farming, and storing supplies for winter. If the harvest failed, or the winter was too long, people died. Not in battle, but quietly, from hunger. Homes were simple, longhouses made of wood, shared by entire families. Sometimes even animals lived inside to keep the space warm. Privacy did not exist. Life was shared, constant, unavoidable. But one thing most people get wrong is hygiene. Vikings were not dirty. In fact, they were known for being unusually clean. They bathed regularly, used combs, cleaned their hair. Some sources even suggest they bathed more often than people in medieval England. Appearance mattered, not for luxury, but for identity. Because how you looked reflected how you lived. Family was also central, not just emotionally, but structurally. Women in Viking society had more rights than many other cultures at the time. They could own property, manage households, and even request divorce. If a husband failed his role, the woman could leave. This was rare in most ancient societies, but in Viking culture, it existed. Religion shaped everything. Vikings believed in many gods: Odin, Thor, Freya. Their world was filled with meaning. Storms were not just weather, they were messages, signs. Life and death were connected to something greater, and death itself was not feared the same way. For many Vikings, dying in battle was seen as honorable, not because of violence, but because of what came after. The idea of Valhalla, a place where warriors would go after death. But this did not mean they wanted to die. It meant they were prepared, because death was always close. Even outside of war, disease, injury, cold, all of it could end a life quickly. There were no guarantees. Children grew up fast. From a young age, they learned responsibility, skills, discipline. There was no extended childhood because the environment didn't allow it. Everyone had a role. Everyone had a purpose. Even travel was dangerous. Sea journeys were unpredictable. Storms, navigation risks, distance. But Vikings still traveled, not just to raid, but to trade, to explore, to survive. They reached distant lands, not because it was easy, but because they had to. But there were other parts of Viking life that are often overlooked. For example, law and order. Vikings did not live in chaos. They had structured systems, assemblies known as things, where disputes were settled, conflicts were discussed publicly, decisions were made by groups, not just individuals. This was not random, it was controlled. Because survival required order. Even honor had rules. If someone insulted you or damaged your reputation, you were expected to respond, not always with violence, but with action. Because reputation in Viking society was everything, and once it was lost, it was difficult to recover. There were also strict expectations about loyalty to family, to community, to agreements. Breaking trust had consequences, not always immediate, but remembered. Because people relied on each other, and in a harsh environment, trust was survival. Another overlooked part was trade. Vikings were not only raiders, they were merchants. They traveled long distances, exchanging goods, furs, weapons, metal, even everyday items. They built connections across regions, not just through force, but through interaction. And this required skill, communication, awareness, because not every encounter was hostile. Some were necessary and even peaceful. Life was a balance. between danger and cooperation, between strength and intelligence. April 7th, 2026, 1926, Ilya Voitenko. And that balance defined everything. And despite everything, there was structure, order, community. Because survival required cooperation, not chaos, not constant war, but balance. Between strength and discipline, between risk and control. Viking life was not about glory. It was about endurance, adapting to a world that gave nothing for free. And the real question is, if you lived in that world, would you survive?